I've recently asked myself the question if Dark Souls 1 is actually as good as we remember. No. The answer to that question is no. But why is that? The first Dark Souls game is essentially responsible for the birth of the Souls-like genre. And since its release in 2011, the many sequels and spin-offs created by Fromsoft have massively expanded on the ideas and systems found in the first Dark Souls. Not to mention the numerous Souls-likes created by other developers who have helped this still relatively young genre of games grow substantially. Let's dive into the reasons as to why I think that Dark Souls 1 doesn't quite hold up in 2024. First and foremost, I absolutely love the first Dark Souls. It was my first exposure to the series and to this day is one of my favorite games of all time. That being said, I am well aware of its shortcomings. Back when I first played it, sometime between 2013 and 2014, this style of game was still fairly new. And if you're watching this video, you probably also still remember the early era of people getting absolutely rattled by Blighttown, Sense Fortress, and the infamous duo that is Ornstein and Smo. In general, people loved this game for how unforgiving it was. It didn't try to handhold you through the entire experience, as many games at the time ended up doing. But it wasn't just the raw gameplay-first approach which drew people in, it was also its mysterious world. Winding paths, unpredictable structures, and surprising shortcuts. Dark Souls 1, maybe intentionally or not, resembling a 3D Metroidvania, was a shining example for the importance of level and world design. The unforgettable boss battles were another high point of the Dark Souls experience, and overcoming challenges like these felt incredibly meaningful and rewarding. There are many things to love about this game. But as the Souls-like genre has matured over the past decade, many aspects of this original incarnation have become outdated, especially by today's standards set by FromSoftware's newer works. Let's start with some of the obvious ones. Many things in the original Dark Souls were simply inconvenient. The first thing that comes to mind is the god-awful weapon upgrade system, requiring you to first collect 10 different upgrades for the blacksmiths, which then also have to be given to the correct ones, as you can't just have everything be done by Andre. Look at the poor guy, he's got enough work to do. After all of the upgrades have been properly distributed between the 4 different blacksmiths, you'll obviously also need the right amount of weapon upgrade materials to fully enhance your weapon of choice. FromSoft. Who thought that it was a good idea to have 15 different types of upgrade materials? I really can't wrap my head around how you made upgrading a weapon this confusing. And thankfully, this has been done infinitely better in FromSoft's newest Souls like Elden Ring, where you basically only have 2 different upgrade paths and it's much more streamlined. Other than the upgrades, we have another big inconvenience, which is the multiplayer. I absolutely love playing through all of the Souls games with my friends, so I ended up just pushing through the cumbersome co-op system. But after experiencing what it could have been with newer entries in the series, as well as other developers trying their hands at the formula, it feels really awful to go back to Dark Souls 1. Frequent connection issues, restrictive level requirements to actually connect, let's not talk about Dark Souls 2 in this context, and the fact that your progress isn't actually shared, so you basically have to do the content for each player individually, really brings down the whole co-op experience. The addition of password-based matchmaking and level scaling in the later entries, as well as in the Dark Souls 1 remaster from 2018, have already made things a lot easier. But this last issue still persists to this day. Having to reconnect every time someone dies, and playing the same content multiple times in the same playthrough isn't necessarily fun. So I really hope that FromSoft reevaluates their approach to co-op for any of their upcoming games. Maybe they should just hire the absolute legend that made the seamless co-op mod for Elden Ring, because that thing is a godsend. But besides these inconveniences, as I called them, there are also some more fundamental issues present in the game. One of the most important aspects in video games is the gameplay, and I would argue that it is the most important aspect. Thankfully, Dark Souls 1's gameplay is at least serviceable in my opinion. Dark Souls 2 still has the worst gameplay feel in the series, but the lack of refinement in many of the movements present in this first game do drag it down quite a bit. The feel of combat in Dark Souls 3, Elden Ring, Bloodborne, and many other Souls-likes from different developers, like Lies of P for example, is quite a bit more responsive compared to Dark Souls 1. It just feels a bit too clunky in many instances, but yet again, the remaster was able to at least add omnidirectional rolling into the game, which already helped out quite a lot. Additionally, the whole magic system found in Dark Souls 1 doesn't really feel fleshed out. Spells can be incredibly powerful, as long as you have the right build, but the almost Dungeons and Dragons-like approach to attuning spells and having a set number of uses for them just doesn't really feel right in the context of the Souls-like combat formula. This might just be me, but I much prefer the approach of later titles, essentially adding back in the MP bar, which actually was already a thing all the way back in Demon Souls. I'm really curious as to why they decided to change it in the first place. Possibly because it was more troublesome to properly balance magic, so they just decided to give us limited uses of spells? I'm reaching here, but maybe you've got a better idea, so let me know in the comments. And while you're at it, maybe consider liking the video or subscribing if you are into Fromsoft games and would like to see more content like this. Looking past the gameplay, another huge aspect of why Dark Souls was so beloved were the incredibly memorable and satisfying boss fights. Yes, I will now proceed to talk negatively about them. I think that we can all agree that the best bosses in this game are all found within the DLC, Artorias of the Abyss. The Sanctuary Guardian, Artorias himself, Manus, and Calamite are all pretty great and mechanically interesting fights, but the same can't be said about many of the main game bosses. There are still some standout ones like our favorite duo Ornstein and Smo, but most other bosses fail to impress in at least one way or another. There's the category of fights which are only interesting because of their arena, like the Taurus Demon, Capra Demon, Centipede Demon, Moonlight Butterfly, and Iron Golem, for example. All of these bosses have very simple movesets and don't really pose much of a threat to you on their own. Here, we often see some sort of gimmick applied to each fight to make it more memorable, like restricting the player movement through tight spaces and deadly drops, or extra enemies placed in the boss arena to create a more difficult encounter. Just to quickly clarify, I am not against making the actual environment a part of the boss fight experience. It's quite the opposite actually. I think that there are many fights throughout the Souls games which have done this very well, but the one problem which permeates through most of these fights in Dark Souls 1 is the fact that the actual boss enemies have an incredibly limited moveset and are otherwise unremarkable. Ceaseless Discharge, Dark Sun Gwyndolin, the Bed of Chaos, and to some extent, most of the remaining bosses rely on some sort of gimmick to varying degrees. The three that I've mentioned directly are the most egregious examples, of course, basically requiring you to do only one specific thing to beat the boss. Again, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as for example, Elden Ring has one of the coolest gimmick boss fights with Rykard, where you are forced to use one specific weapon found in his boss room. This fight is a spectacle beyond belief, and it feels great to use the weapon, so I have very little issues with it. But the Bed of Chaos, on the other hand, I think we are all probably agreeing that this is the worst fight in the first Dark Souls, maybe even in the entire series. The long runback and the unpredictable one-shots in form of the death pits in the boss room make for a very infuriating combination, which doesn't really bring any joy, even when finally overcoming this boss, as it feels less like you've earned the victory and more like you just got lucky. I'd actually be interested to see if someone can say anything good about this boss in the comments, other than maybe the lore attached to it. I'm not going to evaluate every boss individually here, so let me quickly just tell you which of the 22 different boss fights present in the main game I would actually consider as good. The Asylum Demon, for being a fairly well-designed first boss, the Bell Gargoyles, Quelaag, Gaping Dragon, Great Wolf Sif, Ornstein and Smo, and Gwyn, the Lord of Cinder. That's 7 out of 22 bosses. The rest I haven't mentioned directly here all have some sort of redeeming quality to them, while ultimately falling short in one way or another. Many of the concepts for boss fights you saw in this game would eventually be done way better in the later entries to the series. When Dark Souls first released in 2011, most of these fights might have been pretty good, but looking back at it now, with over a decade of innovation in the genre, they are passable at best. The world of Dark Souls 1 is one of the most praised aspects of the game, as the first half of the game is absolutely stellar when it comes to atmosphere and level design. It is also commonly accepted that Fromsoft dropped the ball big time with the second half, abandoning the dense and intertwined nature of the levels to give you a choice to decide for yourself in which order you want to approach the rest of the game. As a result of that, the remaining levels became more linear in structure and had some big balancing issues since you could theoretically approach them in any order. Whichever path you chose, it would start to get easier the closer you were to the end of the game, since all of the levels were designed to be beatable right after Anor Londo. Speaking of which, I am about to make some Dark Souls purists very angry, because I think that Anor Londo is overrated. Yes, this area has one of the most beautiful vistas in the entire game. Yes, it's got the infamous rafters and archer sections, and yes, it houses one of the best and most iconic bosses of this game. But the actual level itself is kinda lackluster. Apart from the few sections that I've just mentioned, a lot of enemy placements just seem a bit random and don't really create any interesting gameplay scenarios. The initial reveal of the city was great, but once you realize that you can't really do much inside except walk around some very wide paths, and eventually a very samey looking interior inside of the actual cathedral, a lot of the magic of this place is lost. It would have been so much more interesting to start somewhere at the bottom of the city and having to climb your way up towards the cathedral in a similar manner to the Undead Burg segment of the early game. And even if this was a deliberate choice from the developers to not have a similar structure to the early game for the sake of not reusing the same idea, I still think that the exploration of Anor Londo could have been done so much better. Especially the cathedral itself, with its incredibly uninspired looking interior. But I think that I've said enough about this place, since there are a few more different areas that need addressing. Lost Izalith. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. No, but seriously, we all know that this place is a pile of garbage. While the lore might be cool and there are some hints of interesting places to explore, the whole experience just feels like the area was added in the last 10 days of development after they forgot that it existed. I don't really have too many complaints about the Duke's Archives or New Londo, but the Tomb of the Giants, on the other hand, wasn't much fun to explore. A pitch-black cave with no real points of interest other than getting you to the Gravelord Nito fight at the very end. The most exciting thing you can find in here is Patches, who proceeds to boot you into a dark pit, which isn't all that hard to get out of. I'm sure that there are some people who might really enjoy this area, but for me personally, this one is more of a chore to get through and not much else. Lastly, I quickly want to say that I'm not as offended as some other people by the shift in the second half of the game. At least in theory. Unlocking some new paths which were previously inaccessible and being able to now teleport around to accommodate the more linear levels isn't entirely bad. But what is bad is the drop in quality of the individual zones, as well as the balancing issues I've mentioned earlier. The world of Dark Souls 1 is simply inconsistent. The highs of the early game level design are incredible, but the lows are low enough to generally drag down the entire experience. In conclusion, to go back to my original question I posed and promptly answered at the very start of the video, is Dark Souls as good as we remember? No. And I think that I've outlined my reasons well enough for you to understand how I arrived at this conclusion. But again, I still love Dark Souls 1. It will always have a special place in my heart, and there are indeed many good things about this game. I also made a video about Dark Souls 2 a while back, so if you enjoyed this one, maybe go check it out as well. A big thanks goes out to all of the upper-class citizens directly funding this channel. Some of you have been members for over 6 months already, like Puddle, Sua, Blandy, Burb, Dice, Ashton, and Cameron. I can't thank you enough for this support. But that's gonna be it from me. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.